In this 7th astrophysics video, we'll discuss how stars evolve as they leave the main sequence. So for a good understanding of the subject, it is essential that you are familiar with the main sequence step. If this is not your case, I recommend that you watch the video that appears in the upper right corner of the screen before proceeding. As always, our explanations will be clear and concise. We kindly ask you to click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell. Your support is crucial to the growth of our channel and helps us continue creating quality content. Thanks in advance for your support. All stars go through the main sequence phase, during which hydrogen in the core undergoes nuclear fusion to form helium. The two nuclear fusion reactions are the proton-proton chain and the CNO cycle. The two processes can be summarized in the following manner. The nuclear fusion reaction converts four hydrogen nuclei into a single helium nucleus together with positrons, neutrinos, and some high-energy gamma rays. The total life of a star is determined by its mass. Because stars spend about 90% of their lives burning hydrogen into helium on the main sequence, their main sequence lifetime is also determined by their mass. Therefore, to understand stellar evolution, it is important to determine how long a star remains on the main sequence. That is, how long the burning of hydrogen in the center of the star lasts. Let's start by remembering that stars are composed almost entirely of hydrogen and helium. A star like our Sun contains about 33% of hydrogen by mass and 25% helium. If determined by the number of nuclei, then it is 92% hydrogen and 7.8% helium. The remaining 2% by mass or 0.2% by number are all the heavier elements. An expression for the lifetime of the main sequence is given approximately by. Now let's calculate the lifetime of some stars on the main sequence. Calculate the lifespan of the main sequence for the following stars. Using the equation for the lifetime given above, we obtain As we can see, stars have varying lifespans. Whilst our Sun will spend 10 billion years on the main sequence, a 10 solar mass star will only last 10 million years on the main sequence. Low mass stars can spend up 100 billion years on the main sequence. This is much longer than the age of the universe, which is approximately equal to 13 billion years. This means that all the low-mass stars that have formed are still in the main sequence. They have not had time to evolve away from the main sequence. Before these calculations, you might have thought that a more massive star have more fuel available, so it can spend more time on the main sequence fusing hydrogen into helium. And as you can see from the example we just solved, the opposite is true. More massive stars have a stronger gravitational force acting inward, so they need higher core temperatures and pressures to support themselves against gravitational collapse. And for this reason, nuclear reactions occur at a much higher rate than in lower mass stars. The result is that massive stars use up their core hydrogen fuel rapidly and spend less time on the main sequence. From the previous discussion, we cannot expect stars with masses much smaller than that of the Sun to have evolved off the main sequence yet. Therefore, we restrict our discussion of post-main sequence stellar evolution to stars with masses greater than about 0.8 solar masses, which we observe for globular cluster stars. Red giants. All stars within this range will eventually become white dwarfs, but they differ slightly in their evolutionary tracks while on the HR diagram. As a star ages on the main sequence, more and more of the hydrogen fuses to helium. The heavier helium sinks to the center of the core, and the mean molecular weight of the medium in the stellar core increases. This is a slow process, especially for lower mass stars, and less so for higher mass stars. In intermediate mass stars, the CNO cycle dominates. The nuclear energy is generated in a very small central volume. The concentration of energy production and the high density in the innermost portion of the core make the stellar core opaque. As the transport of energy by radiation is not efficient, the cores of these stars become convective. These stars form a radiative envelope. This occurs because the regions of partial ionization of hydrogen and helium with high opacity are located very high in the stellar atmosphere with very low density. Therefore, energy can be transported by radiation in a very efficient way. Intermediate mass stars have convective cores and radiative envelopes. In low mass stars, the proton-proton chain dominates. There's not as much concentration of energy in the innermost portion of the core, so radiative transport can handle the energy flux, so low mass stars have radiative cores. The outer portion of solar mass stars is cool enough that hydrogen is not as strongly ionized, and because the atoms are bound, it transmits less radiation, so convection dominates. Therefore, solar mass stars have radiative cores with convective envelopes in the outer portion of the star. When all the hydrogen in the stellar core has been used in fusion the hydrogen into helium, the fusion process stops because the core has not yet reached the temperature of helium fusion. This disturbs the balance between internal and gravitational pressure, as the outward radiation pressure is shut off. The inward gravitational attraction causes the helium core to contract, which converts gravitational potential energy into thermal energy. Most of the outer layers of the star are made of hydrogen, including the layer surrounding the core. The rise in temperature heats the shell of hydrogen surrounding the core until it is hot enough to start hydrogen fusion. This new hydrogen shell burning pushes outward through the star, causing its outer layers to expand. As the outer layers expand, they cool because they are now farther away from the energy source. This process causes the star to expand significantly while also decreasing its effective temperature. The expansion of the hydrogen envelope terminates the main sequence lifetime. The star will appear to cool slowly and will undergo a modest increase in luminosity. Initially, the center of a star is hotter than the edge of its core, and heat flows outwards until the core becomes isothermal. The core grows as the outer shell burns fresh fuel, leaving helium ash behind. The star's position on the HR diagram follows an almost horizontal path to the right of its position on the main sequence, and these stars are called subgiants. Observe the path of a star similar to our Sun and a star with 5 solar masses in the HR diagram. I'm leaving out some details to keep the video concise, but the general picture is this. For an intermediate mass star, the subgiant phase ends when its core reaches approximately 12% of its total mass. The core then heats and contracts until helium fusion begins at 100 million degrees, making the beginning of the red giant phase. The helium fusion leads to an increase in pressure. The gas then expands and cools, reducing the burning rate and reestablishing the equilibrium. When this occurs, the core stops contracting and the star is fully separated by nuclear burning. Helium ignition moves a star towards higher surface temperatures on the HR diagram. The star then moves along the horizontal branch, where it has both helium core burning and hydrogen shell burning. For low-mass stars, the process is more complicated. Low-mass stars have a denser core than more massive stars because they need to contract more to reach the hydrogen fusion temperature during the main sequence phase. The star contains a vast sea of electrons stripped from its parent nuclei by the heat in the stellar interior. Electrons obey the Pauli exclusion principle. This principle states that two identical subatomic particles cannot occupy the same quantum state at the same time. Electrons in the star's core cannot be squeezed too close due to the Pauli exclusion principle, which creates pressure not dependent on temperature. A subgiant star's core with one solar mass is supported by generated electrons which resist gravity. When helium burning starts, there's a temperature increase, but no pressure increase. This prevents expansion and a temperature drop that would stabilize the core. So when helium fusion begins at 100 million degrees, the pressure remains unchanged, and the temperature rises rapidly in a runaway explosion called the helium flash. The process of fusion of helium into carbon is called the triple alpha process, and it occurs in two steps. First, two helium nuclei fuse to form a nucleus of beryllium-8. Second, beryllium-8 is a very unstable isotope that would normally break up into two helium nuclei in about 10 to minus 12 seconds. However, at the densities in the core of a red giant, the beryllium-8 nucleus will likely encounter another helium nucleus before this occurs, fusing with it to form carbon-12 and releasing a gamma photon. As three helium nuclei, also known as alpha particles, are used in this process, it is called the triple alpha process. The carbon-12 nucleus, in turn, may fuse with another helium-4 nucleus to produce oxygen-16 and a gamma photon. The horizontal branch phase ends when all the helium in the core has fused into carbon and oxygen. But since carbon and oxygen nuclei have more protons than helium nuclei, a higher temperature is needed for fusion. In stars with less than 8 solar masses, there isn't enough gravitational energy to generate the required temperature. Thus, no more core fusion can happen, leaving the core as an inert, degenerate ball of carbon and oxygen, with a final mass on the order of 1 solar mass. Once the core runs out of helium, the core contracts again. The core contraction does, however, generate sufficient heat for the surrounding layer of helium around the core to start fusing with itself and is still surrounded by an outer shell of hydrogen burning. The star ascends in luminosity and moves toward the asymptotic giant branch on the HR diagram. Outer layers of AGB stars are only weakly held by gravity because they are away from the core, and the radiation pressure tends to blow away much of the outer layer. The carbon core attains an incredibly high density. The electrons in the core once again become degenerated. The contraction of the core ceases, and its temperature stops rising. Such an object is called a planetary nebula. The planetary nebula continues to spread out with time, becoming more diffuse and cooler, gradually dispersing into interstellar space. In doing so, it enriches the interstellar medium with atoms of helium, carbon, and oxygen, dragged up by convection from the depths of the core into the envelope during the star's final years. After a few thousand years, the planetary nebula dissipates, leaving behind just the degenerate remnant carbon core, a white dwarf star. The core is very small. By the time the envelope is ejected as a planetary nebula, it has shrunk to about the size of Earth. Its mass is about half the mass of the Sun, shining only by stored heat, not by nuclear reactions. The core's temperature and size give rise to its new name, white dwarf. As the start of this span, the star is a very cool red giant with a hot, compressed core. Then, when the planetary nebula stage starts, it starts to peel off the cool outer layers, revealing the hot core. In a way, it sort of jumps from the far right side of the HR diagram to the left side in a very short time. The post-main sequence evolution of stars with higher initial mass has some distinct differences from that outlined above for solar and intermediate mass stars. Upon exhaustion of hydrogen fuel at the end of the main sequence, such stars again expand in radius because of the overluminosity of hydrogen shell burning. However, the high luminosity and high surface temperature on the main sequence means that their stellar envelopes remain radiative even as they expand, never reaching the cool temperatures so that the overall luminosity remains essentially constant. Evolutionary tracks for these massive stars thus move horizontally across the supergiant region of the HR diagram. Gravitational core contraction after all the core helium is used up generates a temperature of about 5 times 10 to 8 Kelvin, at which point carbon nuclei fuse to produce sodium, neon, and magnesium. Once all the core carbon is consumed, further collapse pushes temperatures to about 10 to 9 Kelvin, and the same cycle repeats until the core becomes hot enough for the next nuclear fuel to burn. In very heavy stars, the core eventually ends up being iron, which has the most strongly bound nuclei. However, each such higher level of nucleosynthesis yields proportionally less and less energy. For such massive stars, the final stages of post-main sequence evolution are thus characterized by an increasingly massive iron core that can no longer produce any energy by further fusion. With the build-up of iron in the core, there is an increasingly strong gravity, but without the further fusion-generated energy to keep the temperature high. The core pressure becomes unable to support the mass above. This eventually leads to a catastrophic core collapse, halted only when the electrons merge with the protons in the iron nuclei to make the entire core into a collection of neutrons, with a density so high that they now actually become neutron-generated. The stiffness of this neutron-generated core leads to a rebound in the collapse. This collapse takes only about 0.25 seconds, so leaves a gap between the core and the outer layers. The outer layers fall into the gap, resulting in a rapid rise in temperature and causing a huge explosion that blows away everything except the core. This colossal explosion of a star is called a supernova. Though the dividing line is not exact, it is true that all stars with initial masses, 8 solar masses and 30 solar masses, will end their lives with a supernova, leaving behind a neutron star. Because of their small size, neutron stars do not radiate much thermal energy, regardless of how large temperature is. They are therefore not bright enough to be plotted on an HR diagram. For more massive stars with initial masses greater than 30 solar masses, is thought will end their lives with a supernova, leaving behind a black hole. Black holes emit no light on their own and cannot be seen. Their surroundings may become visible if they accrete mass from a binary companion, but they still cannot be placed on an HR diagram.